From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and in this episode, I'm going to do something a little different. Today, I'm going to share a little bit about my own process of language learning as an adult. And the reason I'm doing this is because I wanted to speak a little bit about my experiences in language learning for people who might be considering learning a language having never done it before, or people who might be in the early phases, maybe the first year or two of learning a language. So I'm just going to share a few of my reflections in the hopes that it might help to elucidate the process a little bit and perhaps give some additional dimensions to understanding the process of language learning. So as I've done with all of the other episodes, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I grew up and how that kind of led to my motivation for learning Italian. So I grew up in a pretty typical 1980s, 1990s suburban context. I had quite a few relatives who I visited a lot, but everybody was kind of living in this sort of almost ahistorical mode. There was not a real sense of a connection to history. There was a sense that we were almost outside of history and living in a space that didn't have a lot of historical resonances, which is very different from how people in other parts of the world might live and how people might live today in perhaps the same geographic space that I grew up in. So in this environment, there was an unusual object that I encountered in my life as a child and then as an adolescent. And even today, this object continues to hold a certain fascination for me. And that is a box of letters, a shoebox that was in my grandmother's house on top of a shelf. And I remember the first time I saw it, she pulled it down, we opened it up, and inside this old dusty shoebox was a stack of documents, all sort of folded up and all together in a kind of undifferentiated pile. And in this pile were mostly letters that were really old, that were written in a language I didn't understand and couldn't read, that had a writing that was difficult to decipher. There were a few other documents as well. There were some photographs, mostly of dead people in coffins, which I found very, very strange. Having never seen a dead person for a very long time in my childhood, I thought it was totally weird. And then there were also some old government documents. So there was a huge certificate that had some columns on it that was in a language I didn't understand. And then there were some American documents as well. And this was, I could see a document of naturalization for what I learned were my great-grandparents, my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother. And this box was something that always interested me because it felt like a kind of message from a world outside of the small world that I inhabited, something totally different from what I might have encountered before. And so I was very curious about it, and I was curious all the more because I couldn't decipher what was written on the letters. I didn't know the meanings that this box contained. And as I got a little older, I learned that the box was from my great-grandmother, who lived from 1894 to 1969, and they were letters that she had received from her sisters who had moved to different parts of the world. And so it was really a kind of one-sided correspondence. I couldn't see the letters that she wrote, only the letters that she received. And I was, of course, curious about the world that these letters were from. And yet, at that point in my early adolescent years, I was not able to really decipher these letters or find the resources to be able to do so. In 1999, my parents, perhaps perceiving this interest and also for their own reasons, decided to take me and my brother and some other relatives on a trip to Italy. And on this trip, we were able to go to the small village where my great grandparents were from, and were able to meet many cousins, many people living there who were related to me. Of course, the descendants of the people who had written some of the letters, and other descendants as well. This small village is called Marziai. It is located in the Veneto region of Italy. It's sort of to the northwest of Venice by about an hour and a half or so. It is in the Belluno region. That's the larger city in the area. And it is in the Dolomite Mountains. So tall, jagged mountains covered with trees. And there is a river that passes right by this village. It's called the Piave River. It's a large river, clearly much larger. There's gravel in the riverbed and a trickle from what the river used to be. This river was dammed in the mid 20th century, so you can imagine what the river might have been at one time, but it's really just a small river now. But this place was almost otherworldly to me. It was totally different from anything that I'd ever seen. Just the way of life was so different. People lived together in a small village. Everybody kind of knew each other. And also there was a real sense of community, I would say, that I found really, really interesting and enjoyable. And yet at the same time, I was very frustrated on this trip because I was unable to communicate with anybody. And they had some limited knowledge of English, but they were not able to communicate too much to us beyond just basic questions, basic comments about how are you, that kind of thing. And I said to them as best as I could muster that I would come back and that I would be able to communicate with them in Italian. And I really held this in my mind as a promise. I felt very strongly that going to see this place was the next step in a process that had initiated with my discovery and appreciation of the box of letters. So I went to college, and when I went there, the thing I was most focused on, really laser focused on, was learning Italian. I did the other stuff as well. I didn't care too much about it because for me, learning Italian and fulfilling this promise became like a personal quest. And so I threw myself into learning Italian. I loved it. I enjoyed everything about it. And yet I was also frustrated by it in some ways in these first 2 years of learning the language, because it was very slow. It took forever in my mind to make progress. I imagined that I might, take a semester or two of the language and be pretty highly communicative in the language, but I really wasn't. And that's normal. It's a long process to learn a language. And I was also frustrated because I was in a class with people who knew Spanish and people who knew French, and they immediately took to the language and were communicative and speaking in long sentences, and I could barely get out just a couple of words, and I was very self-conscious that I was not speaking grammatically, and I tried very hard to impose kind of my early adult mentality on the language. I tried to speak in longer sentences. I tried to communicate complex ideas. And really, looking back now, I see that that was not the thing to do. The thing to do is just stay focused on what you've learned and build out from that very slowly, but really solidify the basics of the language. In all of this, in these 2 years, I felt this frustration, but at the same time, I was motivated to learn. And I had a deep sense of motivation in learning the language because I had this promise to fulfill, and I had this journey to undertake and to understand really the meanings inside that box that I had located when I was a kid. So that was my motivation for it. And I think that in this episode, I kind of want to just emphasize the idea of the motivation for language learning because it's been my experience in my own language learning process and also now in assisting other people with their own process of language learning that a motivation is something that's really going to empower and power you as you encounter the challenges and frustrations, especially in the earlier phases of language learning. So when you think about your motivation for language learning, maybe it's to communicate with the people around you. Maybe it's so that you can take a trip somewhere and that you're motivated to learn the vocabulary and the ways of communicating that allow you to undertake that trip. It could be that you want to communicate with a specific person, and there you can kind of have contact with that person and learn a certain way of communicating with them in the language. Or maybe it's to enter more deeply into a culture that interests you. I think these are all very good motivations, and I think that one of the most powerful things that you can do as a language learner early on in the process is to identify those motivations in order to help overcome the challenges and the frustrations that you might feel in the first phases of the process. For me, the motivation, as I look back now, was really about a couple of things. In a certain sense, it was a motivation of self-transcendence to look at myself and where I was and to create another self or to create an amplified or bigger or more multi-dimensional self. It was also to understand a world that had vanished before I was born. I felt very much growing up and in my early 20s that I had been born into this ahistorical world, as I mentioned earlier. And I wanted to understand what was the larger historical context in which I found myself, even though I couldn't communicate with the people who had been part of that earlier world. And also I was motivated by what I thought I might find by entering deeply into the culture of the place that my family was from and into Italian culture as seen through the language as well. Looking back now, after 20 years of learning Italian and speaking it as a non-native speaker, but as a speaker at a relatively high level of proficiency, it's just interesting to think about the ways in which this motivation has extended from that initial observation into something that's been going on now in my life for 2 decades. That's given it a meaning and a context that I had sought so much, and the unexpected twists and turns that it has taken over the years. And that's something that I think I'd like to talk about in other episodes whenever I have the chance to do it. Whenever I'm having trouble finding somebody who wants to be a guest on this podcast, I think I'll do that. So that's basically the little vignette that I wanted to share with you today. I guess maybe as a kind of postscript, I'd like to mention that as I went through those letters years later with a much broader knowledge, not just of the language and the orthography, the writing, but also the context in which those letters were written, the personal context and the historical context. These are letters that were written starting in the early 1920s when my great-grandparents left Italy. And it's a correspondence that continued all the way through the late 60s when both of my great-grandparents died, and a correspondence that continued in a very much reduced way after their deaths with my grandmother and my great aunt. They talk about the challenges that they encounter, my great-grandparents, when they are moving to the United States. It's clear that these issues are referenced in the letters that are present to me. And it's also talking about the day-to-day life and the big issues, the living issues that my relatives encountered in their respective areas, which were northern Italy, but also Brazil. We had some family members moved to Brazil as well. So these letters kind of span the globe in terms of where they're coming from. They also mention historical events. There's a letter that talks at length about the moon landing. They're very this writer, this relative of mine, was incredibly fascinated by it and had a lot to say. Um, and and there's a kind of sad part where, my great grandmother dies and she receives multiple letters saying, "Where are you? You haven't responded to me. Is everything okay?" So the correspondence ends on that note, and yet it continues with my great grandmother's children and talking about the lives that continue into that second generation. Starting in the 1980s, I had some cousins go back to Italy. My great grandparents never went back to Italy, and so that kind of closed the loop, I would say. And since then, I and several of my cousins have been in touch with these cousins in Italy. And so the correspondence did eventually lead, after many decades, to an in-person reunion. And I try to go back when I can. I've not been back for a number of years. I'm hoping to go back soon now that the pandemic is waning to a certain extent. And so yeah, it's just been kind of, as I said, the motivation for learning Italian, and really the energy that pushed me into the world of language learning, and that opened so many things, so many ideas for me that I think are incredibly important, that I think I'll talk about in later episodes. And so I hope that by sharing this, I've helped you kind of understand a little bit how you might use the sense of personal motivation in your own language learning goals, whatever those might be. And so next time we'll be talking about Dominican Spanish. I look forward to sharing that conversation with you in 2 weeks.